Picture New York City in the 1920s, narrow tenement streets thick with smoke, whispered deals sealed with a handshake and a knife, and a war brewing beneath the surface of polite society. In the shadows of that war stood a man who didn't just survive the bloodshed, he rewrote the rules of the underworld itself. They called him Little Caesar. He studied for the priesthood, quoted Julius Caesar from memory, and dreamed of an empire built not on chaos, but on order. His name was Salvatore Maranzano, and before he was gunned down in his own office, betrayed by the very system he built, he did something no gangster before him had ever done, he created the modern Mafia. This is the story of the boss who tried to become Caesar of the underworld, and paid for it with his life. Before we descend into this story, drop a comment and let me know, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your city? I love knowing that people from every corner of the world are sitting down to hear these tales from the shadows of history. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, because this next hour is going to take you deep into the world of blood oaths, betrayal, and the birth of an empire that still echoes today. In the rolling hills of Sicily, in a small town called Castellammare del Golfo, a boy was born in 1886 into a world that had already decided what he would become. Castellammare del Golfo was not an ordinary town, it was a breeding ground for men who would one day shape the American underworld more than any other single place on earth. The town's name would later become legendary, spoken with a kind of reverence and fear in the back rooms of New York's Little Italy, because from these narrow streets and sun-bleached hillsides came a wave of immigrants who carried with them not just their language and their food, but an entire code of honor, secrecy, and violence that had been refined over centuries of Sicilian history. Salvatore Maranzano grew up breathing that code like air. He was not the son of poverty in the way so many gangster stories begin, his family had some standing, some education behind them, and young Salvatore was, by all accounts, a sharp and curious child. He had a mind built for study, and his parents, hoping for something respectable and safe for their son, pushed him toward the church. For a time, it seemed as though Salvatore Maranzano might become a priest. He studied theology. He studied Latin. He absorbed the discipline of Catholic ritual, the hierarchy of bishops and cardinals, the idea that a structured chain of command, sealed with oaths and answerable to a higher authority, could hold together something as fragile and combustible as human loyalty. But there was another book in his life, one that would shape him even more than Scripture. Salvatore Maranzano was obsessed with Julius Caesar. Not the historical footnotes, not the Wikipedia version we all know today, he studied the man deeply, reading translated texts and absorbing the story of a Roman general who rose through cunning, alliance-building, ruthless war-making, and above all, an unshakable belief that he was destined to rule. Maranzano didn't just admire Caesar. He identified with him. He saw in Caesar's story a blueprint, a man who used organization, hierarchy, and calculated violence to bring order to chaos, and who imposed his will not through random savagery but through structure. Somewhere in that hillside town in Sicily, a teenage boy began to imagine himself not as a foot soldier of crime, but as an emperor of it. Of course, the priesthood did not hold him. Whether it was the pull of ambition, the reality of his family's connections to older criminal networks in Sicily, or simply the restlessness of a mind too large for a small town, Salvatore Maranzano drifted away from the church and towards something far darker, and far more familiar to the world he had been born into. Sicily in the early 1900s was a land where the state's authority was thin and often corrupt, where local strongmen, the original men of honor, the mafiosi, filled the vacuum left by weak government. These were not simple thugs. They were men who positioned themselves as protectors, arbitrators, and enforcers of a private justice system that operated parallel to, and often above, the official one. Maranzano, with his intelligence, his education, and his family's connections, found himself drawn into this world, and he rose within it with a speed that surprised even his elders. By the time he reached his 20s, Salvatore Maranzano was already deeply entrenched in Sicilian organized crime, aligned with a powerful clan structure that operated with the kind of discipline the old Roman legions might have envied. He was known as intelligent, calculating, and patient, qualities that set him apart from the hot-tempered brawlers who filled the ranks of most criminal organizations. He didn't need to be the loudest man in the room. He only needed to be the one who was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But Sicily, for all its opportunities in the underworld, was becoming a dangerous place to build an empire. The Italian government, under increasing pressure to modernize and project strength, began cracking down on organized crime in Sicily with a ferocity that had not been seen before. This crackdown would eventually explode into a full assault under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, which viewed the Mafia's parallel power structure as an intolerable rival to the total authority of the state. Mussolini's prefect, Cesare Mori, a man who would become infamously known as the Iron Prefect, began a systematic campaign to dismantle Sicilian Mafia clans, arresting, torturing, and imprisoning thousands of suspected members. For ambitious young men like Salvatore Maranzano, the writing was on the wall. Sicily was becoming too small, too dangerous, and too tightly watched for a man who dreamed of building something as vast as Caesar's Rome. So, like so many before him, Salvatore Maranzano turned his eyes across the ocean, to America, and specifically, to New York City, where an entire underworld was still being formed, where structures were loose, alliances were fluid, and a man with vision, discipline, and the right connections could carve out something extraordinary. He arrived in the United States in the early 1920s, stepping off the boat into a city that was, in its own chaotic way, the perfect canvas for a man who saw himself as an emperor in waiting. New York in the 1920s was a city transformed overnight by an unlikely force, prohibition. When the United States government banned the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol in 1920, it did not stop Americans from drinking. It simply moved the entire liquor industry into the shadows, creating one of the most lucrative black markets in human history almost instantaneously. Suddenly, ordinary criminals, men who might have spent their lives running small-time rackets, gambling dens, and protection schemes, found themselves sitting on a river of cash so vast it reshaped the entire structure of American crime. Bootlegging empires sprang up overnight. Speakeasies packed with flappers and jazz musicians lined the streets, hidden behind unmarked doors and coded knocks. And feeding all of it was an underground supply chain of smuggled and illegally distilled liquor, protected by bribed police officers, corrupted politicians, and gangs willing to kill for control of the territory. Into this maelstrom stepped Salvatore Maranzano, and he did not arrive as just another immigrant looking for work. He arrived as a man with a plan, connections back to powerful Sicilian clans, and a network of fellow Castellammarese immigrants who trusted him and looked to him as a natural leader. In New York, the Italian-American underworld was already fracturing into competing factions, and one of the most significant fault lines ran straight through the community Maranzano belonged to, the so-called Castellammarese faction, made up largely of immigrants from his hometown and the surrounding region, versus other Sicilian and Italian criminal factions who were fighting for dominance over bootlegging territories, gambling operations, and extortion rackets across the city. At the center of this rivalry stood a man named Salvatore d'Aquila, and later, more significantly, a rising boss named Joe, the Boss, Masuria. Masuria was everything Maranzano was not: loud, impulsive, physically imposing, ruled by appetite and instinct rather than calculation. He had clawed his way to power through sheer brutality and a willingness to eliminate rivals without hesitation, and by the mid-1920s, Masuria had positioned himself as one of the most powerful crime bosses in New York City, controlling a vast network of rackets and commanding fierce loyalty through a mixture of fear and reward. Masuria saw the Castellammarese faction, the very community that Maranzano represented, as a threat to be crushed, a group of immigrants from a rival Sicilian region who dared to operate independently within what he considered his territory. This was the powder keg that Salvatore Maranzano walked into. And rather than shy away from the danger, he embraced it, because he saw in this looming conflict an opportunity, the same kind of opportunity Caesar had seen in the political chaos of the late Roman Republic. Where others saw only danger and bloodshed, Maranzano saw the raw material of an empire waiting to be built by the man clever enough to organize it. He did not rush into open warfare immediately. This is perhaps one of the most important things to understand about Salvatore Maranzano's rise: he was, above all else, patient. While rival gangsters were fighting turf wars in the streets, shooting each other over minor slights and territorial disputes, Maranzano spent his early years in America building relationships, assessing the landscape, and quietly consolidating support among the Castellammarese community and their allies. He positioned himself not merely as a gang leader, but as a legitimate authority figure within this community, a man to be consulted, respected, and obeyed. He drew on his education, his command of language, his understanding of law and structure, to present himself as something more refined than the average street thug. He wore expensive suits. He spoke with measured confidence. He carried himself like a man who belonged in a position of command, and slowly, the people around him began to believe it too. But make no mistake, beneath the polished exterior and the philosophical musings about Julius Caesar, Salvatore Maranzano was every bit as capable of violence as the roughest gangster on the street. He understood that authority in this world could not be built on charisma and organization alone, it had to be backed by the credible threat of force, by a willingness to eliminate anyone who challenged it. He built alliances with dangerous, capable men, smugglers, gunmen, and racketeers who respected his vision and his growing power. Among the most consequential of these relationships would be his connection to a young, ambitious gangster named Salvatore Lucania, a man history would come to know by another name entirely, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. At this stage in the story, Luciano was still rising through the ranks, working alongside and sometimes under Joe Masuria, but quietly building his own network of loyal, capable men, including future legends like Vito Genovese and Meyer Lansky, men who would prove instrumental not just in New York's criminal underworld, but in reshaping it entirely. The tension between the Masuria faction and the Castellammarese faction simmered for years before it finally erupted into what history would remember as the Castellammarese War, a brutal, bloody conflict that would tear through the streets of New York from 1930 to 1931, claiming dozens of lives and reshaping the entire structure of organized crime in America. But before the first shots of that war were fired, Salvatore Maranzano had already spent years laying the groundwork, cultivating loyalty, building his reputation as a man of vision rather than mere violence, and waiting, with the patience of a general studying a battlefield, for the perfect moment to make his move. It's worth pausing here to understand what made Maranzano so genuinely unique among the gangsters of his era, because this is the key to understanding everything that follows in his story. Most crime bosses of this period thought in terms of immediate power: control this block, dominate this racket, eliminate this rival. They thought like street fighters, because in many ways, that's exactly what they were, men who had risen from poverty and violence, who understood the world primarily through the lens of survival and dominance. Salvatore Maranzano thought differently. He thought like an architect. He wasn't merely interested in becoming the most powerful individual gangster in New York, he wanted to design an entire system, a structure of governance for organized crime itself, modeled explicitly on the very institutions he had studied as a young man, the Roman legions with their clear chains of command, the Catholic Church with its hierarchy of authority and its rituals of loyalty and obedience, and yes, the political genius of Julius Caesar, who understood that lasting power required more than brute force, it required legitimacy, structure, and the appearance of order. This vision would not fully reveal itself until after the bloodshed of the Castellammarese War had run its course, but the seeds of it were planted here, in these early years, as Salvatore Maranzano quietly built his base of power in New York City. He was, in these years, a man watching, waiting, and calculating, studying not just his rival Joe Masuria, but the entire chaotic, disorganized structure of American organized crime, and seeing within that chaos an opportunity that no one else had the vision, or perhaps the audacity, to imagine, the opportunity to become not just a boss, but the boss of bosses, a title that did not yet exist in America, because a system that required such a title did not yet exist either. Salvatore Maranzano intended to create both. As the 1920s drew to a close, New York's underworld stood on the edge of a war that would determine control over one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history. On one side stood Joe Masuria, brutal, entrenched, and increasingly paranoid as he sensed the growing strength of his rivals. On the other side stood the Castellammarese faction, and increasingly, standing at their head, Salvatore Maranzano, a man who had spent years positioning himself not just as a fighter in this coming war, but as its ultimate architect and beneficiary. What none of them could have fully predicted, not even Maranzano himself in these early years, was just how completely this coming conflict would reshape American crime, or how the very system Maranzano would build in its aftermath would ultimately become the instrument of his own destruction. The boy who once dreamed of the priesthood, who once buried himself in the words of Julius Caesar, was about to get his chance to build an empire. But history, as it so often does, was preparing a very different ending for its Caesar than the one he had imagined for himself. The stage was set. The war was coming. And Salvatore Maranzano was ready. By 1930, the tension that had been simmering for years between Joe, the boss, Mafia and the Castellammarese faction could no longer be contained. What began as territorial friction and ethnic rivalry within New York's Italian underworld exploded into one of the bloodiest and most consequential gang conflicts in American history, a war that would not only determine who controlled the city's rackets, but would ultimately give birth to the very structure of organized crime that still exists in whispered legend today. This was the Castellammarese War, and Salvatore Maranzano stood at its center, not as a reckless brawler swept up in violence, but as a general commanding a campaign he had been quietly preparing for years. To understand how this war began, you have to understand Joe Mafia, a man whose name alone could silence a room in Little Italy. Mafia had built his empire the old way, through sheer intimidation, unpredictable violence, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened his position before they had the chance to organize against him. He was thick-necked, heavy-set, and famously described by his own men as almost impossible to hit with a bullet, not because of any supernatural ability, but because of sheer luck that had followed him through multiple assassination attempts over the years. His survival had become legend in itself, whispered about in barbershops and social clubs, and it had given him a dangerous sense of invincibility. Mafia believed, quite genuinely, that he could not be killed. This belief made him bold. It also made him careless. Mafia viewed the Castellammarese immigrants, men from Maranzano's own hometown and the surrounding villages of western Sicily, as outsiders who had overstepped their place. In his mind, New York's underworld belonged to him and the network of allies he had cultivated over the years, and any faction that refused to fall in line under his authority was, by definition, a threat that needed to be crushed. What Mafia failed to fully appreciate, and this would prove to be his fatal miscalculation, was that the Castellammarese were not simply a loose collection of immigrants he could bully into submission. They were bound by something deeper, a shared regional identity, a code of loyalty, and increasingly, the quiet, calculated leadership of Salvatore Maranzano, who had spent years cultivating exactly this kind of unity for exactly this kind of moment. The first killings came quietly, almost invisibly, the way these things always seem to begin. A bootlegger here, found in an alley with a bullet in the back of his skull. A gambling operator there, disappeared without explanation, his family left to whisper about what might have happened. These early killings were testing the waters, both sides probing for weaknesses, trying to determine how far the other was willing to go before full-scale war became inevitable. But as 1930 wore on, the violence accelerated, and what had been a series of isolated incidents became something far more organized and far more deadly, a coordinated campaign of assassination that would eventually claim the lives of dozens of men on both sides. Mafia struck first with real intent, ordering the deaths of several prominent Castellammarese figures in an attempt to decapitate the faction before it could fully organize against him. He believed, as so many overconfident men before him had believed, that a swift and brutal show of force would end the conflict before it truly began, that fear alone would be enough to make the Castellammarese fold, apologize, and return to their place beneath his authority. He did not yet understand the kind of man he was dealing with in Salvatore Maranzano. Because while Mafia fought this war the way he had always fought every conflict, through raw intimidation and impulsive violence, Maranzano fought it like the student of history he had always been. He did not panic in the face of Mafia's aggression. He did not rush his men into the streets for immediate, emotional retaliation. Instead, he retreated into strategy, drawing on every lesson he had absorbed from his study of Roman military campaigns and the political maneuvering of ancient generals. He understood that wars were not won by whoever struck first or whoever struck hardest, but by whoever managed resources, loyalty, and information most effectively over time. He began positioning his most capable men, quiet, disciplined killers who would follow orders without hesitation, into strategic roles, while simultaneously working behind the scenes to identify weaknesses within Massuria's own organization that could be exploited. And here is where the story takes one of its most fascinating and darkly ironic turns, because within Massuria's own inner circle, there existed a young man who had grown increasingly disillusioned with his boss's leadership, a man who privately believed that the entire structure of Italian-American organized crime needed to be modernized, streamlined, and freed from the endless ethnic feuding that kept consuming lives and profits. That man was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had risen through Massuria's organization with remarkable speed, proving himself not just as a capable enforcer, but as a shrewd businessman who understood that the future of organized crime lay not in tribal warfare between Sicilian factions, but in cooperation, professionalism, and the pursuit of profit above all else. Luciano had already begun quietly building relationships that crossed ethnic and factional lines, most notably with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, men who shared his vision of crime as a business rather than a matter of honor and vendetta. To Luciano, the ongoing war between Massuria and the Castellammarese represented exactly the kind of self-destructive, old-world thinking that was holding back the true potential of organized crime in America. Men were dying, profits were being disrupted, and law enforcement attention was increasing, all in service of a conflict rooted in old grudges and regional pride that meant less and less to a new generation of gangsters who had been born or raised in America rather than in the villages of Sicily. Salvatore Maranzano, ever the careful observer, recognized this fracture within Massuria's ranks, and he began cultivating a relationship with Luciano, carefully, patiently, through intermediaries and quiet conversations, testing whether the ambitious young lieutenant might be persuaded to see where his true interests lay. It was a dangerous game for both men. For Luciano, any hint of disloyalty to Massuria discovered prematurely would mean certain death. For Maranzano, trusting a man still officially aligned with his enemy required a calculated risk that could easily backfire into a trap. But both men were gamblers by nature, and both understood that the old structure of the underworld, with its endless, bloody wars over honor and territory, was fundamentally unsustainable. A deal began to take shape in the shadows, one that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire war. Meanwhile, the violence in the streets continued to escalate throughout 1930 and into 1931. New York's Italian-American neighborhoods lived under a constant, suffocating tension during this period, men disappearing in the middle of the night, gunfire echoing through residential streets, funeral processions becoming a grim, regular feature of community life. Restaurant owners and shopkeepers learned to recognize the signs of an impending hit and would quietly usher customers out the back door when certain men walked in through the front. Children were taught not to ask questions when their fathers came home late, or didn't come home at all. This was the atmosphere Salvatore Maranzano operated within, a world thick with fear and suspicion, where a single wrong word to the wrong person could mean a death sentence, and where loyalty itself had become a currency more valuable than money. Throughout this period, Maranzano continued to demonstrate the qualities that set him apart from every other player in this deadly game. He was disciplined where others were reckless. He was patient where others demanded immediate satisfaction. And critically, he understood something about human psychology that Massuria, for all his brutal cunning, never fully grasped, that men do not follow leaders purely out of fear forever. Fear can compel obedience in the short term, but it breeds resentment, and resentment, given enough time and the right opportunity, curdles into betrayal. Massuria had built his empire on fear, and by 1931, cracks were beginning to show in the loyalty of men who had once followed him without question. Maranzano, by contrast, cultivated something closer to genuine respect among his own followers. He listened to his men. He rewarded loyalty generously. He presented himself not as a tyrant to be feared, but as a legitimate authority to be respected, drawing, once again, on that education in church hierarchy and Roman governance that had shaped his worldview since childhood. Under his leadership, the Castellammarese faction did not simply survive Massuria's initial onslaught, it grew stronger, more organized, and more disciplined with each passing month, even as the death toll on both sides continued to climb. By early 1931, the war had reached a kind of exhausted stalemate. Both sides had suffered significant losses. Law enforcement attention was intensifying as the body count in New York streets became increasingly difficult for the police and press to ignore. And perhaps most importantly, many of the men fighting on Masuria's behalf had begun to quietly question whether continuing to shed blood for their boss's pride and territorial ambition was truly worth the risk, especially when an increasingly attractive alternative had begun to present itself through the whispered negotiations between Maranzano and Luciano. The endgame, when it finally arrived, came not through some climactic battle in the streets, but through betrayal, the same kind of calculated betrayal that had toppled empires throughout history, the very history Maranzano had studied so intently in his youth. On April 15, 1931, Charles "Lucky" Luciano arranged to have lunch with his boss, Joe Masuria, at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tomorrow in Coney Island, Brooklyn. It was meant to look like an ordinary afternoon, two men enjoying a meal, perhaps discussing business, perhaps simply relaxing away from the tensions of the war that had consumed their world for over a year. According to the accounts that have survived, the two men ate for hours, played cards, and appeared entirely at ease with one another. Then, at some point during the meal, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. And in that moment, four gunmen, men who had been waiting for exactly this signal, entered the restaurant and opened fire on Joe Masuria, killing him at the table where he sat. The man who had survived so many previous assassination attempts, whose legend of invincibility had grown so powerful that even his enemies had begun to wonder if he truly could not be killed, died in a hail of bullets in a Coney Island restaurant, betrayed by the very lieutenant he had trusted and promoted, at the exact moment that lieutenant had stepped away to ensure his own hands remained clean of the act. The death of Joe Masuria sent shockwaves through the entire structure of the American underworld. For over a year, his name had been synonymous with power and violence in New York's Italian-American criminal world, and now, in an instant, he was gone, eliminated not by his sworn enemies in open warfare, but by treachery from within his own ranks. And with his death, the Castellammarese War effectively came to an end. Salvatore Maranzano had won. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because Maranzano's victory in this war was not simply a military triumph, it was the fulfillment of years of careful planning, patient alliance building, and strategic vision that stretched back to his earliest days in America. With Masuria dead and his organization in disarray, Salvatore Maranzano emerged from the wreckage of this brutal conflict as the single most powerful figure in New York's Italian-American underworld. The various factions that had fought and bled throughout the Castellammarese War now looked to him, and to him alone, as the man who had successfully navigated this treacherous conflict to its conclusion. And it was here, in the immediate aftermath of the war, that Salvatore Maranzano finally revealed the true scope of his ambition, an ambition that went far beyond simply claiming the territory and rackets that had once belonged to Joe Masuria. He did not merely want to be the strongest individual gang leader in New York. He wanted to reorganize the entire structure of Italian-American organized crime into something entirely new, a formalized system of governance, borrowed explicitly from the two institutions that had shaped his intellectual worldview since childhood, the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church, and the military organization of the ancient Roman legions under leaders like Julius Caesar. In the weeks following Masuria's assassination, Maranzano called together a massive gathering of Italian-American mob figures from across New York and beyond. Some accounts suggest as many as several hundred men attended this historic meeting, held in a large hall rented for the occasion. It was here that Salvatore Maranzano laid out his vision for the future of organized crime in America, a vision that would fundamentally reshape the underworld for generations to come. He proposed the creation of what would become known as the Five Families of New York, distinct criminal organizations, each with its own boss, underboss, and structured chain of command, each controlling specific territories and rackets, but all operating under an overarching system of rules designed to minimize the kind of chaotic, destructive warfare that had just consumed the city for over a year. At the top of this new structure, naturally, stood Salvatore Maranzano himself, who took for himself a title that had never before existed in American organized crime, Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. It was, in every sense, the fulfillment of his lifelong obsession with Julius Caesar. Where Caesar had unified the fractured, warring factions of Rome under his singular authority, Maranzano now sought to unify the fractured, warring factions of the American Mafia under his own. He established rules of conduct, protocols for resolving disputes between families without resorting to open warfare, and a formal hierarchy that mirrored, in striking detail, the structure of the Catholic Church he had once studied to join, bosses functioning as bishops, underbosses as auxiliary authorities, capos commanding their own soldiers, all bound by oaths of loyalty and silence that echoed the sacred vows he had once considered taking himself. For a brief, remarkable moment in the autumn of 1931, it seemed as though Salvatore Maranzano had achieved exactly what he had spent his entire life working toward. He had studied Caesar's rise to power, and now, standing at the head of a newly organized criminal empire spanning the largest city in America, he appeared to have equaled his hero's achievement. The war was over. The bloodshed had produced, in its aftermath, order, a structured, hierarchical system designed to prevent exactly the kind of destructive chaos that had just claimed so many lives. But Julius Caesar's story, as Salvatore Maranzano knew better than almost anyone alive, did not end with triumph and unchallenged authority. It ended in betrayal, in a room full of men he trusted, on a day he never saw coming. And as the autumn of 1931 gave way to the final months of that fateful year, Salvatore Maranzano, the boy who had once dreamed of the priesthood, who had built an empire in the image of ancient Rome, who had just achieved a level of power no Italian-American gangster had ever held before him, was about to discover that the very system he had created, the very men he had elevated to power in the aftermath of his victory, harbored ambitions of their own. Among them was the same man whose betrayal had made Maranzano's victory possible in the first place, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who was already beginning to ask himself a dangerous question. If the old system of a single, all-powerful boss had just led to one bloody war, what was to stop it from leading to another? The empire Salvatore Maranzano had built was about to become the instrument of his own downfall. In the autumn of 1931, Salvatore Maranzano stood at the absolute peak of his power. He had done what no other man in the history of American organized crime had ever accomplished. He had taken the fractured, blood-soaked chaos of the Castellammarese War and transformed it into something resembling order. He held court from a suite of offices on the 9th floor of the New York Central Building at 230 Park Avenue, a location he chose with the same deliberate symbolism he applied to everything else in his life. This was not some back-alley social club or a dimly lit basement where gangsters huddled over cards and whiskey. This was a legitimate office building in the heart of Manhattan, a place where lawyers and businessmen conducted their affairs in daylight, and Maranzano wanted his own criminal empire to project that same air of legitimacy, permanence, and respectability. He even had a fake business listed on the directory, a real estate concern, to explain the constant flow of men in expensive suits coming and going from his office throughout the day. This choice of headquarters tells you almost everything you need to know about who Salvatore Maranzano believed himself to be at this moment in his life. He did not see himself as a common criminal hiding from the law in the shadows. He saw himself as an executive, a statesman, the head of a vast and legitimate organization that simply happened to operate outside the bounds of American law. He surrounded himself with the trappings of legitimate power, fine furniture, a private secretary, armed bodyguards who were instructed to behave with the discretion and professionalism of corporate security rather than street muscle. Visitors who came to see him were often struck by how calm, measured, and almost professorial he seemed, discussing the future of his organization with the same careful, deliberate cadence he might have used decades earlier if he had indeed become the priest his parents once hoped he would be. And in these months following his victory in the Castellammarese War, Salvatore Maranzano set about the work of formalizing the system that would define organized crime in America for the rest of the century. He didn't simply declare himself boss of all bosses and leave it at that. He built out an entire structure of governance beneath that title, one borrowed explicitly, almost brazenly, from institutions he had studied since his youth. Beneath him, and beneath the individual bosses of what would become known as the Five Families, he established the rank of underboss, a kind of second-in-command who would manage day-to-day operations and serve as a buffer between the boss and the soldiers on the street. Beneath the underboss, he established the position of capodecina, or capo, a captain who would command a crew of soldiers, manage specific rackets and territories, and answer directly up the chain of command. And at the base of this pyramid stood the soldiers themselves, made men who had been formally inducted into the organization through ritual and blood oath, sworn to obey the chain of command above them without question, and bound by a code of silence, omerta, that had been imported directly from the Sicilian villages where this entire system had first been born generations earlier. This structure, elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications, would go on to define organized crime in America for the better part of a century. Every subsequent mafia family, in New York and beyond, would organize itself according to the blueprint Salvatore Maranzano laid out in the final months of 1931. It is difficult to overstate how significant this achievement truly was. Before Maranzano, Italian-American organized crime had existed as a loose, often chaotic collection of rival gangs, prone to exactly the kind of destructive, bloody warfare that had just consumed New York for over a year. After Maranzano, it existed as something closer to a functioning, if criminal, government, with clear lines of authority, established protocols for resolving disputes, and a formalized process for managing conflicts between families that did not automatically default to open warfare in the streets. He also established what would become one of the most important and enduring aspects of American mafia culture, the concept of families as the fundamental organizational unit, each with defined territories and each expected to respect the boundaries of the others. This was, in many ways, Maranzano's answer to the very war that had brought him to power, a war that had, at its root, been sparked by exactly the kind of territorial confusion and competing claims that his new system was designed to prevent. If every family had clearly defined boundaries, and every dispute had an established process for resolution, appeals made up the chain of command, ultimately reaching Maranzano himself as the final arbiter, then, in theory, the kind of catastrophic, citywide bloodshed of the previous 18 months could be avoided in the future. There is something almost tragically beautiful in how earnestly Salvatore Maranzano seemed to believe in this vision. Whatever else you might say about the man, and there is plenty to say, given the violence and betrayal that characterized his entire rise to power, he genuinely appeared to believe that he was creating something valuable, something that would bring stability and order to a world that had known only chaos and bloodshed for far too long. He spoke to his lieutenants and the various family bosses beneath him with the language of statesmanship, framing his new organization not as a mere criminal enterprise, but as a kind of parallel civilization, complete with its own laws, its own courts, its own enforcement mechanisms, and its own code of honor that, in his mind, elevated it above the common criminality of street gangs and amateur hoodlums. He held gatherings that echoed, with almost eerie precision, the structure of a Roman Senate or a council of Catholic bishops. Family bosses would travel from across the city, and sometimes from other cities entirely, to meet with Maranzano and discuss matters of policy, territory, and dispute resolution. He spoke often of Julius Caesar during these meetings, drawing explicit parallels between his own situation and that of his historical idol, a man who had taken the fractured, warring factions of the late Roman Republic and unified them under a single, stabilizing authority. Some of his own men later recalled that Maranzano kept books about Caesar and Roman history in his office, and that he would occasionally read passages aloud to underscore points he was making about strategy, loyalty, or the proper exercise of authority. But here is where the tragedy of Salvatore Maranzano's story begins to take shape, because the very history he had studied so intently, the very man he modeled himself after so completely, held within it a warning that Maranzano either failed to fully absorb, or simply refused to believe applied to himself. Julius Caesar's triumph had not lasted. His consolidation of power, however brilliant and historically significant, had provoked fear and resentment among the very men who had once supported his rise, men who came to believe that Caesar's growing, seemingly unchecked authority represented a threat to their own position and, more broadly, to the entire structure of power they had all once shared more equally. And so those men who had once called Caesar friend and ally, conspired together in secret, and on the Ides of March, they ended his life with their own hands in the halls of the very institution he had sought to dominate. Salvatore Maranzano, the student of history, was about to become one of its most striking repetitions. The first cracks in Maranzano's new empire appeared almost immediately, and they appeared exactly where you might expect them to, if you understood anything about human ambition and the psychology of men who have just tasted power for the first time. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the very man whose betrayal of Joe Masuria had made Maranzano's ultimate victory possible, had not orchestrated that betrayal purely out of loyalty to Maranzano or the Castellammarese cause. Luciano had acted, in large part, out of his own broader vision for the future of organized crime, a vision that was, in many critical respects, fundamentally incompatible with the very system Maranzano was now building. Where Maranzano believed in a rigid, hierarchical structure with a single, supreme authority at the top, a Caesar, a boss of all bosses whose word was final and whose position was, in theory, permanent, Luciano had come to believe in something quite different. Luciano envisioned a more collaborative, business-oriented approach to organized crime, one where power was distributed more broadly among a commission of equals, where profit and efficient business practice took precedence over the old-world traditions of honor, ethnic loyalty, and rigid hierarchy that had defined the Sicilian Mafia for generations. Luciano had spent years building relationships across ethnic lines, with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and Italian gangsters from regions and backgrounds entirely outside the narrow Castellammarese and Sicilian traditions that Maranzano held so dear. To Luciano, Maranzano's insistence on placing himself at the absolute top of a rigid pyramid, unaccountable to anyone beneath him, looked disturbingly similar to exactly the kind of unstable, single point of failure leadership structure that had led to Masuria's downfall in the first place. If one man held all the power, then one man's death, or one man's paranoia, or one man's greed, could once again plunge the entire organization into the kind of destructive chaos that everyone had supposedly just fought so hard to end. And there was another problem, one that Maranzano himself was largely responsible for creating through his own behavior in these final months of 1931. Power, once tasted in its purest and most absolute form, has a way of transforming even the most disciplined and thoughtful men into something crueler and more paranoid than they once were. As Salvatore Maranzano settled into his role as boss of all bosses, those closest to him began to notice troubling changes in his demeanor and his decision-making. The careful, patient strategist who had spent years quietly building alliances and waiting for the perfect moment to strike began to give way to something more suspicious, more controlling, and increasingly paranoid about the loyalty of the very men he had elevated to power in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War. Maranzano began to view Luciano, in particular, with a growing and not entirely unjustified wariness. He recognized, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the organization, that Luciano possessed exactly the kind of ambition, intelligence, and cross-factional influence that could someday pose a genuine threat to his own authority. Luciano was younger, more connected to the emerging generation of American-born and American-raised gangsters who felt increasingly disconnected from the old Sicilian traditions that Maranzano held so sacred. Luciano's relationships with non-Italian criminal figures, particularly Jewish gangsters like Lansky, represented exactly the kind of boundary-crossing cooperation that Maranzano's rigid, ethnically bound family structure was not designed to accommodate. And perhaps most dangerously of all, from Maranzano's perspective, Luciano had already demonstrated, through his role in Masuria's assassination, that he was entirely capable of turning against a boss he had once served loyally, if he came to believe that boss no longer served his own interests. According to numerous historical accounts, Maranzano began making inquiries in late 1931 about hiring an outside gunman to eliminate Luciano and several of his closest allies, including Vito Genovese, before they could organize any potential move against him. Some accounts suggest he considered reaching out to Vincent "Mad Dog" Call, a notoriously unpredictable and dangerous Irish-American gangster known for his willingness to take on hits that more established Italian gunmen might have refused, precisely because Call had no particular loyalty to anyone within the Italian-American underworld and could be relied upon to simply execute the job for the right price without becoming entangled in the complex web of family loyalties and obligations that governed the rest of the organization. But word of Maranzano's plans, as so often happens in a world built on shifting loyalties and constant surveillance, began to leak. Whether through a careless comment, a bribed informant, or simply the natural paranoia and vigilance that men like Luciano maintained at all times precisely because they understood how quickly the tables could turn in this world. Luciano learned that Maranzano was moving against him. And Luciano, ever the pragmatist, understood immediately that he now faced a stark and unforgiving choice: strike first, or die. This is perhaps the most darkly poetic aspect of Salvatore Maranzano's entire story, the detail that elevates it from a simple gangland betrayal into something closer to genuine tragedy in the classical sense. Maranzano had spent his entire life studying the story of Julius Caesar, absorbing every lesson about power, loyalty, and the mechanics of political betrayal that ancient history had to offer. And yet, in the final months of his life, he found himself walking directly into the same trap that had consumed his hero nearly 2,000 years earlier, surrounded by ambitious men he had elevated to power, unable or unwilling to fully trust any of them, and ultimately undone not by some external enemy, but by the very lieutenant whose talents and ambition he had recognized as dangerous, and whose elimination he had planned just slightly too slowly. Luciano did not hesitate once he understood the danger he faced. He reached out to his network of allies, including Meyer Lansky, and together they began to plan a preemptive strike against Salvatore Maranzano, one that would need to be executed with precision, speed, and a level of audacity that matched anything Maranzano himself had ever orchestrated. They could not simply send a crew of Italian gunmen to storm Maranzano's office, because Maranzano's own men, loyal to him and suspicious of exactly this kind of internal betrayal, would recognize any Italian gangsters attempting to gain access to the building. Instead, Luciano and Lansky made a decision that would become one of the most famous and consequential choices in the history of American organized crime. They hired a team of Jewish gunmen, men entirely unknown to Maranzano's Sicilian and Italian associates, to pose as government agents, tax investigators or law enforcement officials, in order to gain access to Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue without arousing suspicion. The date they settled on was September 10, 1931, barely a matter of weeks, in some accounts mere days, after Maranzano had begun making his own inquiries about eliminating Luciano and his allies. Time, in this final act of the story, had become the single most decisive factor in determining which man would live and which would die. Salvatore Maranzano, the careful strategist who had spent years patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike against Joe Masuria, had, in this instance, moved just slowly enough to allow his own intended victim the opportunity to strike first. On that September morning, a group of men entered the New York Central Building at 230 Park Avenue, presenting themselves to Maranzano's bodyguards and secretary as government tax agents come to review his business's financial records, a plausible enough cover story given that Maranzano had, in fact, been under increasing scrutiny from federal authorities regarding his finances in recent months. They were waved through without significant resistance, according to most historical accounts, and made their way into the inner office where Salvatore Maranzano sat behind his desk, likely reviewing the very documents and correspondence that governed the sprawling criminal empire he had spent his entire life building toward. What happened next took only moments, but it would echo through the history of organized crime for generations to come. The gunmen drew their weapons and opened fire, and Salvatore Maranzano, the boy who once dreamed of the priesthood, who studied Julius Caesar with the devotion of a true believer, who built the very system of Mafia governance that still exists in some form today, was shot and stabbed to death in his own office, in the same building he had chosen specifically because it represented the legitimacy and permanence he had believed his empire had finally achieved. He died the way his hero had died nearly 2,000 years earlier, not on some distant battlefield, not in an act of open warfare, but betrayed and cut down by men who had once served beneath him, in the very halls of power he believed he had secured for himself. The boss of all bosses, the capo di tutti capi, the man who had modeled his entire life on the rise of Julius Caesar, had now completed that parallel in its most brutal and final form, his own Ides of March, arriving not in the springtime of Rome, but on a September morning in Manhattan, less than a year after he had achieved the absolute summit of everything he had ever wanted. If this story has pulled you in the way it pulled me in when I first researched it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is built entirely around bringing you these deep, cinematic dives into the true stories of the men who built and destroyed empires in the shadows of history. The gunfire that echoed through the 9th floor of 230 Park Avenue on that September morning in 1931 did not just end the life of one man. It closed a chapter of American criminal history that had lasted, in its final and most concentrated form, for barely 5 months, the brief, brilliant, and ultimately doomed reign of Salvatore Maranzano as the first and only official capo di tutti capi in the history of the American Mafia. But if you think for even a moment that his death marked the end of his influence, you would be profoundly mistaken. In many ways, the true, lasting legacy of Salvatore Maranzano was only just beginning to take shape in the days and weeks following his murder, even as his body lay in the city morgue and his name began to fade from the front pages of New York's newspapers. News of Maranzano's assassination spread through the underworld with the speed and hushed urgency that only this kind of seismic event could generate. Within hours, every family boss, every capo, every soldier who had sworn loyalty to the new system Maranzano had built understood that the landscape of power in New York had shifted once again, and shifted in a direction that many of them had quietly hoped for, even if few had dared to say so aloud. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over an organization in the moments after its leader has been killed, not shock, exactly, because everyone in this world understood the risks inherent to the positions they occupied, but a kind of tense, calculating stillness, as every man in the organization tried to determine what this death meant for his own future, his own safety, and his own opportunities. Charles "Lucky" Luciano did not waste this moment. He understood, with the same shrewd pragmatism that had defined his rise through the ranks of 2 consecutive murdered bosses, that the hours and days immediately following an assassination were the most dangerous and most important period in any transition of power. Move too slowly, and rivals could organize against you, using the chaos of the moment to seize control for themselves. Move too aggressively, and you risked appearing exactly like the tyrannical, blood-soaked leaders whose downfall had made your own rise possible in the first place, inviting exactly the kind of resentment and eventual betrayal that had just claimed both Masuria and Maranzano within the span of a single year. So Luciano did something remarkable, something that reveals just how much he had learned from watching 2 successive bosses rise and fall in rapid, bloody succession. He did not declare himself the new boss of all bosses. He did not attempt to simply step into the position Maranzano had vacated and claim the same absolute, singular authority that had made Maranzano both powerful and, ultimately, a target. Instead, Luciano called together the very same family bosses and capos who had, just weeks earlier, pledged their loyalty to Maranzano's vision of a Roman-inspired criminal hierarchy, and he proposed something genuinely revolutionary in the history of organized crime, a governing body, a council of equals, that would come to be known simply as the Commission. This decision, more than perhaps any other single choice Luciano made in his long and consequential criminal career, reveals the fundamental difference between his worldview and Maranzano's. Maranzano, the student of Julius Caesar and Catholic hierarchy, had built a system with himself at the absolute top, a single point of ultimate authority, unaccountable to anyone beneath him, responsible only for maintaining order among the families below. It was an elegant system in theory, borrowed from institutions that had proven remarkably durable throughout human history. But it contained a fatal flaw that Maranzano, for all his careful study of history, had somehow failed to fully internalize. Any system built around a single, supreme authority creates an irresistible target for that authority's elimination, and an irresistible prize for whoever manages to eliminate him. Both Masuria and Maranzano had died, in the end, for exactly this reason, because the position they occupied was too valuable, too absolute, and too dangerous to the men beneath them for that position to remain secure indefinitely. Luciano's commission solved this problem, or at least attempted to, through a fundamentally different structural approach. Rather than a single boss of all bosses standing above the 5 families, the commission would consist of the bosses of the major crime families themselves, meeting together as something resembling a board of directors, making collective decisions about matters that affected the entire organization, resolving disputes between families through negotiation and majority agreement rather than through the singular judgment of one supreme authority, and critically, requiring the approval of the full commission before any family could take action against another boss or family. No single man would ever again hold the kind of absolute, unaccountable power that had made both Masuria and Maranzano into such tempting and vulnerable targets. This was, in its own way, every bit as much a work of historical and institutional borrowing as Maranzano's own system had been, except that where Maranzano had looked to ancient Rome and the Catholic Church for his inspiration, Luciano and his allies were drawing, whether they fully recognized it or not, on distinctly American and distinctly modern models of governance and business organization. The commission functioned, in many respects, like a corporate board, or like the checks and balances built into American constitutional government itself, a system explicitly designed to prevent any single actor from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority that had proven so destabilizing and so dangerous in the immediate past. It was crime organized not as an empire ruled by a Caesar, but as a confederation of independent, semi-autonomous states, bound together by shared interest, mutual obligation, and the ever-present threat of collective retaliation against anyone who violated the established rules. And yet, here is the crucial and often overlooked truth of this entire story, the detail that gives Salvatore Maranzano's legacy its genuinely tragic and ironic weight. The commission that Luciano built to replace Maranzano's system did not actually discard the structural foundation Maranzano had created. It could not have, because that structure, the individual families, each with its own boss, underboss, capos, and soldiers, each operating within defined territories, each bound by the code of omerta and the ritual of formal induction that Maranzano had imported and formalized from Sicilian tradition, had already proven itself remarkably effective at organizing what had previously been chaotic, undisciplined street gangs into functioning, disciplined criminal enterprises. Luciano did not tear down Maranzano's house. He simply removed the throne room at the top of it, replacing a single emperor with a council of equals, while leaving nearly everything else about the underlying architecture fully intact. This is why historians and organized crime researchers, even those who recognize Luciano as the more historically significant and more successful figure in terms of building a lasting criminal empire, still credit Salvatore Maranzano as the true architect of the modern American Mafia's organizational structure. The five families of New York, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, as they would eventually come to be known through various changes in leadership and naming over subsequent decades, trace their fundamental organizational DNA directly back to the structure Maranzano established in the immediate aftermath of the Castellammarese War. Every rank, every title, every procedural protocol for managing disputes and maintaining discipline within these organizations bears the unmistakable fingerprints of a man who spent his childhood studying Catholic hierarchy and Roman military organization, even though that same man was murdered within a matter of months of establishing this very system. There is something almost unbearably poignant about this reality when you sit with it for a while. Salvatore Maranzano died believing, in some sense, that his life's great achievement, the empire he had modeled explicitly on his childhood hero Julius Caesar, had been snatched away from him at the very moment of its completion, destroyed by the same kind of betrayal that had ended Caesar's own life. And in the most immediate, personal sense, that was entirely true. He did not live to see his vision fully realized under his own leadership. He did not get to sit atop the pyramid he had built for more than a few brief months before an assassin's bullets ended both his life and his singular claim to absolute authority. But in a deeper, more structural sense, Maranzano's true legacy did not die with him in that office at 230 Park Avenue. It simply transformed, adapted, and endured under new leadership, becoming something even more durable and more successful than the version he himself had briefly presided over. The commission, once established in the aftermath of Maranzano's death, went on to govern the American Mafia's internal affairs for decades, well beyond the lifetimes of nearly every man who had participated in its founding. It provided a framework for resolving disputes between families that dramatically reduced, though certainly did not eliminate, the kind of destructive, citywide warfare that had characterized the Castellammarese War and the years leading up to it. Families could still go to war with each other under this new system, and indeed they sometimes did, in various conflicts throughout the decades that followed. But the Commission provided mechanisms for de-escalation, negotiation, and collective enforcement of agreed-upon rules that had simply never existed before Maranzano's initial reorganization made such structures conceivable in the first place. Luciano himself went on to become perhaps the single most influential and successful organized crime figure in American history, expanding the reach of the Mafia's business operations into narcotics, expanded gambling operations, labor union racketeering, and a host of other criminal enterprises that generated wealth on a scale that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the street gangs of the early 1920s. He cultivated relationships across ethnic lines that Maranzano, with his deep attachment to Sicilian tradition and hierarchy, likely never would have fully embraced, working closely with Jewish organized crime figures like Meyer Lansky to build what would eventually be described by law enforcement and criminologists as a kind of national crime syndicate, coordinating activities and resolving disputes not just within New York, but across major cities throughout the United States. But even as Luciano's star rose to unprecedented heights within the American underworld, the system he presided over remained, at its structural core, Maranzano's creation. The families, the ranks, the code of silence, the formal induction ceremonies binding new members through blood oaths and ritual, all of it traced directly back to the vision of the boy from Castellammare del Golfo who had once dreamed of the priesthood and had spent his adolescence absorbed in the campaigns of Julius Caesar. Luciano may have removed the emperor from the top of the pyramid, but he built his own throne, and the thrones of every subsequent generation of Mafia leadership, on a foundation that Salvatore Maranzano had poured with his own hands. It is worth pausing here to consider the broader historical and cultural significance of what Maranzano actually accomplished, separate from the tragedy of his own personal downfall. Before his intervention, organized crime among Italian-American immigrant communities in the United States had existed in a state that most historians describe as fundamentally chaotic and unstable, competing gangs and factions, often organized loosely around specific neighborhoods, regional loyalties from the old country, or personal relationships between individual criminals, with no overarching structure governing relationships between different groups, no formal process for resolving disputes short of violence, and no clear mechanism for maintaining discipline or loyalty beyond the immediate, personal authority of whatever local boss happened to command the most fear and respect at any given moment. This chaotic structure, or rather this fundamental lack of structure, had produced exactly the kind of destructive, unpredictable violence that characterized the years leading up to and including the Castellammarese War, a conflict that claimed dozens of lives, disrupted profitable criminal enterprises across the city, and drew increasing and unwelcome attention from law enforcement and the press precisely because it had spiraled so far beyond anyone's ability to control or contain it. Salvatore Maranzano looked at this chaos and saw, with the trained eye of a man who had studied history's most successful systems of governance, an opportunity to impose order where none had previously existed. He understood, in a way that few of his contemporaries fully grasped, that lasting power and lasting profit in the criminal underworld would ultimately depend not on individual acts of violence and intimidation, however impressive or feared, but on the creation of durable institutions capable of managing disputes, maintaining discipline, and coordinating activity across multiple organizations over an extended period of time. This is, in its own dark and unsettling way, a genuinely remarkable intellectual achievement, even though the institution he created was dedicated to fundamentally criminal and often violent purposes. Salvatore Maranzano essentially imported centuries of accumulated wisdom about hierarchical organization, institutional legitimacy, and structured governance, wisdom developed by the Catholic Church over nearly 2,000 years of managing a vast, geographically dispersed religious institution, and by the Roman military and political system that had once governed one of history's largest and most enduring empires, and applied that wisdom directly to the problem of organizing American criminal enterprises in a way that had simply never been attempted with this level of sophistication before. The families he established, the ranks and titles he formalized, the code of conduct he imposed, and the very concept of a structured criminal hierarchy that could persist and adapt across changes in individual leadership, all of this represented a genuine innovation in how organized crime functioned in the United States. An innovation so effective and so durable that it would go on to define the structure of the American Mafia for the better part of the next 60 years, surviving numerous changes in leadership, numerous internal wars and betrayals, and decades of increasingly sophisticated law enforcement efforts to dismantle it. And yet, the man responsible for this innovation died within months of implementing it, killed not by some external enemy or rival organization, but by the very internal dynamics his system was ultimately designed to manage and contain. There is a bitter irony here that feels almost too perfectly constructed to be true, and yet it is entirely, historically accurate. Salvatore Maranzano built a system explicitly designed to prevent the kind of chaotic, destructive power struggles that had defined the Castellammarese War, and in doing so, he inadvertently created the very conditions that made his own elimination not just possible, but from Luciano's perspective, entirely necessary and justified. By formalizing a hierarchy with himself at the absolute top, unaccountable to any collective body or system of checks, Maranzano recreated precisely the kind of single point of failure leadership structure that had already proven fatal to his predecessor, and that would inevitably provoke the same kind of ambitious, capable subordinates to eventually move against him, exactly as he himself had once moved against Masuria. In the years and decades that followed Maranzano's death, as the Commission continued to govern the internal affairs of the American Mafia and as Luciano's own reputation grew into legend, Salvatore Maranzano's name gradually faded from public prominence, overshadowed by the more colorful and more enduringly successful careers of men like Luciano, Lansky, and later figures like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, whose own family name would eventually become almost synonymous with the entire concept of the American Mafia in popular culture. Maranzano became, in many popular retellings of this history, a relatively minor footnote, the doomed, briefly powerful boss who was quickly eliminated to make way for the more successful and more historically significant commission system that followed him. But this popular framing, however understandable given the brevity of Maranzano's actual reign at the top of his own creation, fundamentally understates and misrepresents his true historical significance. Without Salvatore Maranzano's vision, without his careful study of Roman and ecclesiastical hierarchy, without his patient work throughout the 1920s building the Castellammarese faction into a disciplined, loyal organization capable of ultimately defeating Joe Masuria, and without his subsequent decision to formalize the five families system and establish the fundamental ranks and protocols that would govern Italian-American organized crime for generations to come, there would have been no structural foundation for Luciano's commission to inherit and adapt in the first place. Luciano did not build his empire from nothing. He built it, quite literally and quite deliberately, on the architectural blueprint that Salvatore Maranzano had drawn up in the final, brief, and ultimately fatal months of his own extraordinary rise to power. The boy who once dreamed of the priesthood, who studied Julius Caesar with the devotion of a true believer, who built an empire modeled on the very institutions that had shaped his childhood imagination, died believing that his vision had been stolen from him at the moment of its completion. He could not have known, in those final moments in his office at 230 Park Avenue, that the structure he had created would outlive him by nearly a century, shaping the lives and deaths of countless men who would never even know his name, governing an entire criminal underworld long after the specific details of his own brief, brilliant, and tragic reign had faded into historical obscurity. To truly understand the depth of Salvatore Maranzano's influence on organized crime in America, you have to look beyond the boardroom politics of the Commission, beyond the territorial boundaries of the five families, and step into something far more intimate and far more chilling, the actual rituals he formalized, the ceremonies through which ordinary men were transformed into made men, bound for life to an organization that demanded absolute loyalty and offered, in return, brotherhood, protection, and a share of the profits flowing through New York's vast criminal economy. Because it was here, in the ceremony of initiation itself, that Salvatore Maranzano's education in Catholic ritual and ancient tradition found its most vivid and enduring expression, a ceremony so steeped in symbolism, so carefully choreographed to evoke solemnity and sacred obligation, that it would go on to define the very identity of the American Mafia for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Before Maranzano's reorganization, the process by which a man became a trusted member of a Sicilian or Italian-American criminal organization had been, like so much else in the pre-commission underworld, informal and inconsistent. Different gangs in different neighborhoods had their own customs, their own understanding of loyalty and obligation, often borrowed loosely from half-remembered traditions carried over from specific villages and regions in Sicily and southern Italy. There was no single, standardized process, no universal ceremony that every made man across every family could recognize and respect as legitimate. Maranzano changed this, just as he changed nearly everything else about the structure of organized crime during his brief but consequential reign, by formalizing an induction ceremony that drew explicitly, unmistakably, on the sacramental traditions of the Catholic Church he had once studied so intently in his youth. The ceremony, as it came to be practiced across the 5 families and eventually across Mafia organizations throughout the United States, followed a remarkably consistent structure that echoed the solemnity of religious ritual with startling precision. A prospective member, having been sponsored by an existing made man who would vouch for his loyalty, discretion, and capability, would be brought before an assembled gathering of made men from his family, a kind of criminal congregation, gathered in secret to witness and sanctify the transformation of an outsider into a full and permanent member of their sacred brotherhood. The room itself was often arranged with a kind of makeshift altar, sometimes featuring a picture of a saint, most commonly a depiction of Saint Gaetano or another figure of particular reverence within Sicilian Catholic tradition, alongside a knife and, in many documented accounts, a gun laid out beside the sacred image, symbolizing the twin obligations of the life the inductee was about to formally enter: violence in service of the family, and death as the price of betrayal. The ceremony itself unfolded through a series of ritualized steps that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Catholic sacramental tradition, even though the content and purpose of the ritual were entirely different in nature. The inductee would typically have his trigger finger pricked with a needle or cut with a knife, drawing blood as a physical manifestation of the sacrifice and permanence of the commitment he was about to make. A holy picture, often depicting a saint, would then be placed in his cupped hands and set alight, and as the paper burned, the inductee would be required to recite an oath, passing the burning image quickly between his hands while speaking words that bound him, for the rest of his life, to the organization he was joining. The exact wording varied somewhat across different families and different eras, but the fundamental content remained remarkably consistent, a solemn promise that just as the saint's image burned to ash, so too would the inductee burn if he ever betrayed the family, if he ever revealed its secrets, if he ever violated the sacred code of silence that governed every aspect of life within this organization. This code of silence, omerta, deserves particular attention, because it represents perhaps the single most consequential cultural and institutional legacy that Salvatore Maranzano imported directly from Sicilian tradition into the American criminal underworld, formalizing what had previously existed as an informal, culturally understood expectation into an explicit, ritually enforced obligation backed by the credible threat of death. Omerta was not simply a practical rule against cooperating with law enforcement, though it certainly served that function. It represented an entire worldview, a comprehensive code of conduct that governed how made men were expected to relate not just to police and prosecutors, but to their own families, their own communities, and even to each other within the criminal organization itself. Under this code, a made man was expected to never, under any circumstances, reveal information about the organization's activities, membership, or leadership to outside authorities, regardless of the personal cost involved. A principle that would be tested time and again over the following decades as law enforcement pressure intensified and individual mobsters faced the agonizing choice between decades in prison and the violation of their sacred oath. But omerta extended further than simple silence in the face of police interrogation. It also governed how disputes within the organization itself were expected to be handled, establishing that internal matters, however serious, were to be resolved through the established chain of command and the protocols Maranzano had built into the family structure, rather than through appeals to outside authority or public exposure of the organization's internal conflicts. It established a kind of parallel legal and moral universe, complete with its own definition of honor, loyalty, and betrayal, entirely separate from and often directly opposed to the legal and moral framework of the broader American society these men lived within. There is something genuinely fascinating, from a historical and sociological perspective, about how effectively this system of ritual and sacred obligation actually functioned in practice, at least for a significant portion of the 20th century. Men who had grown up in America, who had never set foot in Sicily, who spoke English as their primary language and had absorbed countless aspects of mainstream American culture, nonetheless found themselves bound by oaths rooted in centuries-old Sicilian tradition, oaths that Salvatore Maranzano had taken the time to study, formalize, and impose upon an organization that, without his intervention, might never have developed this level of ritual coherence and cultural continuity across generations. The ceremony of making a new member became, in a very real sense, the central sacrament of an entire criminal subculture, and it retained its essential form and symbolic content for decades after Maranzano's own death, long after most of the men participating in these ceremonies had ever heard his name or understood that they were, in some very direct sense, performing a ritual he had personally designed and institutionalized. It's worth pausing to consider why this ritual proved so remarkably durable and effective, because the answer reveals something important about Maranzano's understanding of human psychology and organizational loyalty, an understanding that, once again, traces directly back to his early education in Catholic theology and his lifelong study of how large, complex institutions maintain discipline and cohesion across generations of changing membership. Maranzano understood, perhaps better than any other criminal leader of his era, that verbal promises and financial incentives alone were insufficient to guarantee the kind of absolute, lifelong loyalty that a criminal organization required in order to survive sustained pressure from law enforcement and the constant temptation of betrayal from within. Money could buy short-term cooperation, but money could just as easily be offered by a rival organization, or by federal prosecutors dangling the promise of a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. What Maranzano needed, and what he built through the ceremony of making a new member, was something that operated at a deeper psychological and even spiritual level, a sense of sacred obligation, reinforced through ritual, symbol, and the invocation of religious imagery that carried enormous emotional and cultural weight for the specifically Catholic, specifically Sicilian and Italian-American men who made up the membership of these organizations. By binding new members through a ceremony that so closely mirrored the sacraments of the Catholic Church, a burning saint's image, a blood oath, solemn words spoken before a gathered congregation of witnesses, Maranzano tapped into a well of religious and cultural meaning that ran far deeper than any simple financial or professional relationship could ever hope to reach. For men raised in the deeply Catholic culture of early 20th century Sicily and its immigrant communities in America, the imagery and structure of this ceremony carried genuine, visceral emotional weight, even as they used that same imagery in service of a fundamentally criminal and often deeply violent enterprise. The contradiction inherent in using sacred religious symbolism to sanctify participation in organized crime never seemed to trouble Maranzano himself, and it apparently troubled relatively few of the men who underwent this ceremony over the following decades, perhaps because the entire structure of the Sicilian Mafia tradition Maranzano drew upon had always existed in this same uneasy, syncretic relationship with Catholic faith, presenting itself not as a rejection of religious and moral order, but as a kind of parallel, supplementary code of honor that existed alongside, rather than in direct opposition to, the men's professed Catholic faith. The rank structure that Maranzano formalized alongside this induction ceremony similarly borrowed heavily from ecclesiastical models, creating a chain of command that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Just as a Catholic diocese was governed by a bishop, who oversaw priests responsible for individual parishes, who in turn ministered to the lay people within their congregation, Maranzano's Mafia families were governed by a boss, who oversaw capos responsible for individual crews, who in turn commanded the soldiers who carried out the actual day-to-day business of the organization. This structural parallel was not accidental or merely coincidental. It reflected Maranzano's genuine, deeply held belief that the Catholic Church represented one of history's most successful and durable models of hierarchical organization, capable of maintaining discipline, loyalty, and operational continuity across not just years or decades, but across centuries of changing leadership and shifting circumstances. If such a structure could hold together an institution as vast and as ancient as the Catholic Church, Maranzano reasoned, it could certainly hold together a criminal organization operating within a single American city, however chaotic and violent the immediate circumstances of that organization's founding had been. This borrowing extended even to the language used within the organization to describe relationships and obligations between members. The concept of family itself, so central to how the American Mafia would come to describe and understand its own organizational structure for the rest of the 20th century, carried deliberate echoes of both the literal family relationships that bound many of these men together through blood and marriage, and the broader, more abstract concept of spiritual family and kinship that the Catholic Church had long used to describe the relationship between believers and their religious community. A made man was expected to treat his obligations to his family, meaning the criminal organization he belonged to, with the same seriousness and permanence that a devout Catholic might apply to his obligations to the Church itself, obligations that could not be simply abandoned or renegotiated based on changing personal circumstances or shifting individual preferences. The disciplinary structure Maranzano established similarly reflected this deep engagement with religious and historical models of authority. Violations of the organization's code of conduct were not simply punished through arbitrary, impulsive violence, in the manner that had characterized so much of the internal discipline within pre-commissioned criminal gangs. Instead, Maranzano established something closer to a formal judicial process, however dark and ultimately murderous its actual conclusions might be. Disputes and alleged violations were investigated, evidence was weighed, and decisions about punishment were made by the appropriate level of authority within the chain of command, with serious matters potentially escalating all the way up to the boss himself for final judgment. This process, formalized and consistent, provided a crucial sense of legitimacy and predictability that had been largely absent from the more chaotic, personality-driven discipline of earlier criminal organizations, where punishment for perceived slights or violations could be arbitrary, disproportionate, and driven more by the whims and insecurities of individual leaders than by any consistent, agreed-upon standard of justice. It's worth noting, too, how this entire ritual and structural framework served a crucial practical function beyond its symbolic and psychological significance. It provided a mechanism for controlled, deliberate expansion of the organization's membership, ensuring that new members were carefully vetted, sponsored by trusted existing members who would stake their own reputation on the loyalty and capability of the men they brought into the fold, and bound through ceremony and oath to the same standards of conduct that governed every other member of the organization, regardless of when they had joined or which specific family they belonged to. This created a kind of quality control mechanism that had been largely absent from the more informal, ad hoc recruitment practices of earlier criminal gangs, where loyalty was often tested only after the fact, through the pressures and temptations of actual criminal activity, rather than established in advance through a formal process of vetting, sponsorship, and ritual initiation. The endurance of these rituals across subsequent decades offers perhaps the most compelling evidence of just how successfully Salvatore Maranzano had designed this system to outlast his own individual leadership and even his own physical existence. Long after his death in 1931, long after Luciano's commission had replaced his singular authority with a council of equals, long after subsequent generations of bosses had risen and fallen through natural death, imprisonment, and internal betrayal, the ceremony of making a new member continued to be performed in essentially the same form Maranzano had originally established. The burning saint's image, the blood oath, the solemn recitation of loyalty before an assembled gathering of made men. Federal investigators and cooperating witnesses who would eventually break their own oaths of omerta decades later, providing crucial testimony that would help dismantle major portions of the American Mafia's leadership structure in the 1980s and beyond, consistently described induction ceremonies that bore remarkable resemblance to the earliest documented accounts of this ritual from the years immediately following Maranzano's formalization of the practice. This continuity across more than half a century of American criminal history represents, in its own dark and unsettling way, a genuine testament to the depth and sophistication of Salvatore Maranzano's understanding of institutional design and human psychology. He built not just an organizational chart, not just a set of rules governing territorial boundaries and dispute resolution, but an entire cultural and ritual framework capable of generating the kind of deep, seemingly unshakable loyalty that allowed the American Mafia to survive and even thrive for decades in the face of sustained, increasingly sophisticated efforts by law enforcement to dismantle it. The man himself died within months of establishing this system, betrayed by the very lieutenants he had elevated to power, in an act of violence that mirrored almost exactly the fate of his own historical idol, Julius Caesar. But the rituals he designed, the sacred obligations he formalized, the very concept of the Mafia family, bound together through blood oath and ceremonial initiation, would go on to shape the identity and internal culture of organized crime in America for the better part of a century, a legacy far more enduring, in its own strange and terrible way, than the brief, 5-month reign he was actually able to enjoy at the absolute summit of the empire he had built. History has a peculiar and often unjust way of remembering its architects. We tend to celebrate the men who occupy a throne the longest, who accumulate the most wealth, who leave behind the most dramatic and cinematic stories of rise and eventual fall, while quietly forgetting the men who actually designed the throne itself, who drew up the blueprints for the entire system of power that everyone else would go on to inhabit and exploit for decades afterward. This is precisely the fate that befell Salvatore Maranzano in the decades following his death, and understanding why requires us to look honestly at the strange mechanics of historical memory, popular culture, and the peculiar mythology that has grown up around organized crime in America since the early 20th century. When most people today think of the American Mafia, and specifically of the era immediately surrounding the birth of the modern five-family system, the names that come to mind are almost never Salvatore Maranzano's. Instead, popular imagination gravitates overwhelmingly toward Charles Lucky Luciano, toward Meyer Lansky, toward the later generation of bosses like Carlo Gambino, John Gotti, and the various colorful, headline-grabbing figures who dominated tabloid coverage and eventually Hollywood dramatization throughout the mid to late 20th century. Maranzano, by contrast, occupies a strange and almost ghostly position in popular historical memory, frequently mentioned in passing in books and documentaries about organized crime, acknowledged as a significant figure in the transition from the chaotic Castellammarese War to the more structured commission system, but rarely given the kind of sustained, central attention that his actual historical significance would seem to warrant. Part of this neglect can be explained simply by the brevity of his reign at the absolute top of the organization he built. 5 months is an extraordinarily short period of time to occupy the position of supreme criminal authority, especially when compared to men like Luciano, who despite eventually being imprisoned and later deported, remained a towering and influential figure within organized crime circles for decades, continuing to exert influence over commission affairs even from behind bars and later from exile in Italy. Carlo Gambino, to take another example, led his family for nearly 2 decades, becoming so synonymous with the very concept of mafia leadership in the American popular imagination that his name would eventually become the namesake for one of the enduring 5 families itself. Against this kind of extended, decades-long tenure, Maranzano's brief 5 months at the summit of power can understandably seem like a mere historical footnote, a transitional moment rather than a foundational one. But this framing, however understandable given the simple mathematics of how long each man actually held supreme power, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of Maranzano's actual contribution to the history of organized crime. Consider an analogy that Maranzano himself, given his lifelong fascination with ancient history, might have appreciated. The architects who designed the great cathedrals of medieval Europe often died decades, sometimes even centuries, before their buildings were actually completed. Yet we still credit them as the original visionaries whose designs shaped structures that would stand and serve their communities for hundreds of years afterward. Maranzano's situation bears a striking structural similarity to this kind of architectural legacy. He did not live to see his system fully mature, to watch it survive multiple generations of leadership transitions, to observe how it would adapt and endure through decades of law enforcement pressure and internal power struggles. But he drew up the essential blueprint, and that blueprint proved remarkably durable, shaping the fundamental structure of American organized crime for the better part of the following century. Why, then, has popular culture and historical memory so consistently favored Luciano's narrative over Maranzano's? Part of the answer lies in the simple fact that Luciano survived long enough to become a genuinely compelling, multi-dimensional figure in his own right, one whose life offered decades of additional material for biographers, journalists, and eventually filmmakers to draw upon. Luciano's later life included dramatic elements that made for genuinely compelling storytelling in their own right, his conviction and imprisonment on prostitution-related charges that many historians and legal scholars now believe were at least partially fabricated or exaggerated by an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey, who would go on to become governor of New York and a presidential candidate partly on the strength of his reputation as a crusading anti-crime prosecutor. Luciano's subsequent cooperation with U.S. naval intelligence during World War II, when the government sought Mafia assistance in protecting New York's docks from potential sabotage and later in facilitating intelligence gathering for the Allied invasion of Sicily, added an entirely new and almost unbelievable dimension to his story, one that blurred the line between criminal enterprise and wartime patriotism in ways that captured public fascination for decades. His eventual deportation to Italy, and his continued, shadowy influence over American organized crime affairs even from exile, gave his story a kind of tragic, almost operatic arc that extended across more than 3 decades, providing ample material for the kind of sustained biographical and dramatic treatment that shorter, more compressed stories simply cannot generate in the same way. Maranzano's story, by tragic contrast, was compressed into a matter of years rather than decades, most of it occurring before he had even fully established himself as a public figure of significant note within broader American culture, and ending abruptly in a single, brutal act of violence that closed off any possibility of the kind of extended narrative arc that made Luciano's later life so compelling to subsequent generations of writers and filmmakers. There was no dramatic imprisonment saga, no wartime cooperation with government intelligence agencies, no decades of continued influence from exile. There was simply a rise, a brief and remarkable triumph, and then a swift, violent end, a narrative structure that, however historically significant, simply does not offer the same kind of sustained material for popular cultural memory to work with over time. This dynamic becomes even more pronounced when we consider how organized crime history has been filtered through the specific medium that has done more than perhaps any other single force to shape popular understanding of the American Mafia, Hollywood cinema, and later, prestige television. Consider the most famous and culturally influential dramatization of this exact period in Mafia history, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part II, which includes a storyline explicitly based on the events of the Castellammarese War and the rise of the commission system, though heavily fictionalized and adapted for dramatic purposes. Even in this landmark work of American cinema, which did more to shape popular understanding of Mafia history and culture than perhaps any other single cultural artifact of the 20th century, the historical figure of Salvatore Maranzano does not appear as a directly named character. His story instead absorbed and transformed into composite fictional figures and storylines that borrow elements of his history without ever fully crediting or centering his actual historical role. This pattern of cinematic absorption and transformation, rather than direct, historically grounded portrayal, has characterized most popular treatments of this era in Mafia history. Filmmakers and novelists, quite reasonably from a dramatic and narrative perspective, have tended to gravitate toward the figures whose stories offer the richest, most extended material for adaptation, men like Luciano, whose life spanned decades and included dramatic reversals of fortune, government cooperation, exile, and continued influence from abroad. Maranzano's story, however historically foundational, simply does not offer the same kind of extended dramatic canvas, and so it has tended to appear, when it appears at all, as a kind of prologue or backstory element within larger narratives centered on other, longer-lived figures, rather than as the subject of sustained dramatic treatment in its own right. There is also, it must be said, a kind of dark unfairness embedded in how popular culture has come to understand and categorize the various figures of this founding generation of American organized crime. Luciano, despite his own extensive history of violence, murder, and criminal enterprise, has often been portrayed in popular culture and even in some historical accounts with a kind of grudging admiration, cast as a visionary modernizer who brought professionalism, business acumen, and cross-ethnic cooperation to an underworld that had previously been mired in old-world ethnic feuding and destructive violence. Maranzano, by contrast, has often been portrayed, when he appears at all, in more purely negative terms, as a rigid, old-world traditionalist, obsessed with outdated notions of honor and hierarchy, whose elimination represented a necessary and even welcome modernization of organized crime structure and culture. This characterization, however dramatically convenient it might be for storytellers seeking a clear narrative of progress and modernization, does a genuine disservice to the historical complexity of Maranzano's actual role and legacy. It was Maranzano, after all, not Luciano, who first recognized that the chaotic, destructive warfare of the pre-commission era needed to be replaced by a more structured, disciplined system of governance. It was Maranzano who first formalized the ranks, rituals, and organizational protocols that would go on to define American Mafia culture for the rest of the century. Luciano's genuine and significant innovation was not the creation of structure itself, but rather the transformation of that structure from a single authority model to a collective, council-based model, an important and consequential adaptation, certainly, but one that built directly upon, rather than replacing entirely, the foundational architecture that Maranzano had already established. It is also worth considering how the specific manner of Maranzano's death has shaped, and in some ways distorted, his historical legacy. Because he was killed so quickly after achieving the summit of his power, and because his death came at the hands of men who would go on to build an even more successful and enduring criminal organization in the years that followed, there has been a natural tendency for historians and popular culture alike to view his assassination as a kind of historical verdict on his own leadership and vision, to see his swift downfall as evidence that his particular model of organization, with its rigid hierarchy and single supreme authority, was simply flawed and destined to fail, superseded almost immediately by the superior, more sustainable model that Luciano and his allies subsequently established. But this reading of history, however tempting in its narrative simplicity, ignores a crucial and often overlooked truth: the fact that Maranzano's system needed adaptation and modification does not mean that his foundational contribution was somehow less significant or less enduring than the modifications that followed it. Every great institutional innovation in human history has required subsequent generations of leaders to adapt, adjust, and improve upon the original foundational structure, and this process of adaptation does not diminish the significance of the original innovation itself. The framers of the American Constitution, to take an entirely different but structurally illuminating example, created a system of government that has required numerous amendments, judicial reinterpretations, and structural adaptations over more than 2 centuries of American history. Yet we do not typically dismiss their original contribution as a failure simply because it required subsequent modification to address flaws and changing circumstances that its original authors could not have fully anticipated. Salvatore Maranzano's system similarly required modification almost immediately after its establishment, precisely because it contained a structural flaw: the concentration of absolute, unaccountable authority in a single supreme boss, that made it vulnerable to exactly the kind of internal betrayal that ultimately claimed his own life. But the fact that this flaw needed correction does not erase or diminish the genuine and lasting significance of everything else Maranzano had built: the formal structure of the 5 families, the ranks and titles that would govern Mafia organization for generations, the ritual induction ceremony that would bind members together through sacred oath and blood for the rest of the century, the very concept of organized crime as a structured, disciplined enterprise rather than a chaotic collection of feuding street gangs. Luciano corrected one specific flaw in Maranzano's design, and in doing so, he ensured that Maranzano's broader vision would actually survive and endure, rather than collapsing entirely in the wake of its own founder's assassination. There is also a compelling argument to be made that Maranzano's ultimate personal downfall, however tragic and however swift, should be understood not as evidence of failed vision, but as a kind of necessary sacrifice that allowed his broader institutional innovation to achieve its full and lasting potential. Had Maranzano somehow survived Luciano's plot against him, had he continued to rule as an increasingly paranoid and unaccountable boss of all bosses, it is entirely possible, even likely, that his system would have eventually collapsed under the weight of exactly the kind of destructive internal power struggles that his own rigid hierarchy made almost inevitable over time. By dying when he did, and by making way for Luciano's crucial structural modification establishing the commission as a check on any single boss's absolute authority, Maranzano's foundational vision was, in a strange and tragic way, preserved and strengthened rather than destroyed. The emperor died, but the empire, in its essential structural form, endured and even flourished under new management. This is perhaps the most fitting and poignant historical irony in the entire story of Salvatore Maranzano, a man who modeled his entire life and criminal career on the story of Julius Caesar, who died in almost exactly the same manner as his historical idol, betrayed by trusted subordinates in a scene of sudden, brutal violence, ultimately shared something else in common with Caesar as well, something that neither man could have fully appreciated in the immediate aftermath of their own deaths. Just as Caesar's assassination did not restore the old Roman Republic that his killers claimed to be defending, but instead paved the way for his adopted heir Augustus to establish an even more durable and long-lasting imperial system built upon Caesar's own foundational reforms, Maranzano's assassination did not restore the old chaotic system of feuding, independent gangs that had characterized the pre-Castellammarese War underworld. Instead, it paved the way for Luciano to establish an even more durable and long-lasting commission system, built directly upon the foundational structure that Maranzano himself had first established. Both men, in death, achieved a kind of institutional immortality that eluded them in life, their personal reigns cut brutally short, but their foundational innovations enduring and even flourishing for generations under the leadership of the very men who had orchestrated their deaths. In recent decades, as academic and journalistic interest in the true history of American organized crime has grown more sophisticated and more attentive to primary historical sources rather than simply repeating popular mythology, there has been something of a quiet reassessment of Salvatore Maranzano's actual historical significance. Historians specializing in organized crime, drawing on court records, government wiretap transcripts from later decades, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses who eventually broke the code of omerta that Maranzano himself had helped formalize, have increasingly recognized just how directly and completely the structure he established in 1931 continued to govern Mafia organization and culture for the rest of the century. Books and documentaries focus specifically on the origins and structure of the American Mafia, rather than simply on the biographical dramas of its most colorful individual leaders, have increasingly credited Maranzano as the true architectural genius behind the entire system, even as popular culture continues to gravitate toward the more extended, more dramatically satisfying stories of men like Luciano and his successors. This growing historical reassessment matters, and it matters beyond simply giving credit where credit is historically due. Understanding Salvatore Maranzano's actual role and contribution helps us understand something important about the nature of organized crime itself, and indeed about the nature of institutional power more broadly. It reminds us that the men who build lasting systems and structures are not always the men who benefit most directly or most visibly from those systems, that genuine institutional innovation often requires a kind of intellectual vision and patient, careful planning that has little to do with the more immediate, more visible qualities of charisma, longevity, and dramatic personal narrative that popular culture and historical memory tend to reward and remember. Maranzano was, in the end, more architect than emperor, more theorist than tyrant, a man whose greatest achievement lay not in how long he personally ruled, but in how thoroughly and how durably he reshaped the very structure of power for everyone who came after him. There is one more dimension of Maranzano's legacy worth considering here, one that extends beyond the specific history of American organized crime into a broader reflection on the nature of ambition and its costs. Salvatore Maranzano spent his entire life studying and admiring a man who had achieved extraordinary historical significance and lasting institutional legacy, but who had also died young, betrayed by trusted allies, cut down at what should have been the height of his triumph. And rather than serving as a cautionary tale that might have led Maranzano toward a different, perhaps more cautious approach to his own pursuit of power, Julius Caesar's story instead seems to have functioned as something closer to a template that Maranzano actively, perhaps even unconsciously, sought to replicate in his own life. He achieved his Roman triumph, his consolidation of power, his brief reign as absolute ruler over a system he had spent years carefully constructing. And then, with a kind of tragic, almost mythological inevitability, he met precisely the same fate as his historical idol, betrayed by the very lieutenants he had elevated to power, cut down in the moment of his greatest apparent triumph. Whether Maranzano ever recognized, in his final months and weeks, just how closely his own unfolding story was beginning to mirror the historical narrative that had captivated his imagination since childhood, we can never know for certain. But there is something genuinely haunting in the parallel, something that elevates his story beyond a simple account of gangland betrayal into something closer to genuine historical tragedy in the classical sense, a man destroyed not by external forces beyond his control or comprehension, but by the very qualities and the very vision that had made his rise to power possible in the first place, following a script that history itself seemed to have already written for him, long before he ever set foot on American soil. We have followed Salvatore Maranzano from the sun-drenched hillsides of Castellammare del Golfo, through the halls of a seminary he never finished, into the ancient pages of a book about a Roman general who understood that empires are not built through violence alone, but through the patient, disciplined architecture of loyalty, hierarchy, and law. We have watched him cross an ocean, arrive in a city already boiling with the black market fortunes of prohibition, and slowly, carefully, over the course of nearly a decade, position himself at the center of a community that would become his base of power. We have watched a war unfold, the Castellammarese War, a war he did not start with reckless bloodlust, but one he navigated with the calculated patience of a general who understood that the last man standing is rarely the one who fought the loudest, but the one who thought the furthest ahead. And we have watched him win that war, not through his own hand, but through the calculated betrayal of a lieutenant whose ambitions he had not yet learned to fear enough. We have seen him stand, in the autumn of 1931, at the absolute summit of everything he had ever dreamed of becoming, capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, the American Caesar he had spent his entire life preparing to become. And we have watched that triumph collapse in a matter of months, ended by gunfire and a knife in his own office, betrayed by the very system of ambitious, capable men he himself had elevated into power. Now, in this final chapter, it's worth stepping back from the blood and the betrayal and asking the question that matters most when we tell stories like this one: what did it all actually mean? What was Salvatore Maranzano's life actually for, beyond the violence and the ambition and the tragic, almost predetermined ending? And what can a story like this, nearly a century old now, still teach us about power, about loyalty, about the terrible price so often paid by the men who build the systems that outlive them? The first thing worth understanding, before we can fully appreciate the weight of Maranzano's legacy, is just how completely and how permanently his innovations reshaped organized crime in America. When Salvatore Maranzano arrived in New York in the early 1920s, the Italian-American underworld was a landscape of chaos, competing factions organized loosely around regional loyalty and personal relationships, with no formal structure governing disputes, no standardized process for managing conflict, and no mechanism for maintaining discipline beyond the immediate, personal authority of whichever local boss commanded the most fear at any given moment. This chaos was not merely inefficient, it was lethal, both to the men caught up in its endless cycles of violence and retaliation, and to the broader communities forced to live alongside gang wars that could erupt at any moment over slights and territorial disputes that most ordinary people never even understood. By the time Salvatore Maranzano was gunned down in his office at 230 Park Avenue in September of 1931, that chaotic landscape had been transformed into something fundamentally different, a structured system of families, each with clearly defined territories, each governed by an internal hierarchy of boss, underboss, capo, and soldier, each bound together by a formalized code of conduct and a ritual of initiation that would go on to define Mafia culture and identity for the rest of the century. This structure did not disappear with Maranzano's death. It did not require reinvention by Luciano or any subsequent generation of leadership. It simply absorbed one crucial modification, the replacement of a single, supreme, unaccountable authority with a council of equals, and then it endured, essentially unchanged in its fundamental architecture, for the better part of the next 60 years. Consider the sheer scope of this legacy. The five families of New York, organizations that would go on to be led by some of the most infamous names in American criminal history, from Vito Genovese to Carlo Gambino, from Joseph Bonanno to Paul Castellano, from John Gotti to countless others whose stories have been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films for decades. Every single one of these organizations operated according to the fundamental structural blueprint that Salvatore Maranzano first established in 1931. The rank of capo, the position of underboss, the formal ceremony of making a new member through blood oath and burning saint's image, the code of omerta that would be tested and broken by countless cooperating witnesses across subsequent decades of federal prosecution, all of it traces directly back to the vision of a man who held absolute power for barely 5 months before his own violent death. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something profound about the nature of lasting influence and historical legacy that goes beyond the specific, grim details of organized crime history. We often assume, almost instinctively, that the men and women who leave the deepest mark on history are the ones who accumulate the most power, who hold their positions the longest, who leave behind the most dramatic personal narratives of triumph and eventual downfall. But Salvatore Maranzano's story suggests something more complicated and, in its own way, more interesting, that sometimes the deepest and most lasting influence belongs not to those who occupy power the longest, but to those who design the very systems and structures within which power itself operates. Maranzano's personal reign was brief, almost absurdly so when measured against the decades-long careers of the men who succeeded him. But his structural innovation, his blueprint for organizing criminal enterprise into a disciplined, hierarchical, ritually bound institution, proved to be the single most durable and consequential legacy left by any figure of this founding generation of American organized crime. There is a broader lesson here, one that extends well beyond the specific and often grim history of the Mafia, about the nature of institutional design and its relationship to individual ambition. Salvatore Maranzano wanted, more than anything else, to become a modern Caesar, to achieve personal, singular, unchallenged supremacy over an empire he had spent years carefully constructing. And in this specific, personal ambition, he ultimately failed, just as his historical idol had failed nearly 2,000 years earlier, cut down by betrayal at the very moment his triumph seemed most complete and most secure. But in a broader, more institutional sense, Maranzano's actual achievement, the structural system he designed, the hierarchy he formalized, the rituals he established, succeeded far beyond what even he himself might have imagined in his most ambitious moments, enduring not for the 5 months of his own personal reign, but for generations, shaping the lives and deaths of countless men who would never know his name, governing an entire criminal underworld long after the specific circumstances of his own rise and fall had faded from public memory. This tension between personal ambition and institutional legacy sits at the very heart of what makes Salvatore Maranzano's story so genuinely compelling, so worth telling and retelling nearly a century after his death. He wanted to be remembered as an emperor, as a singular, towering figure whose name would be spoken with the same reverence and fear that men once reserved for Julius Caesar himself. Instead, he is remembered, when he is remembered at all, primarily as an architect, a man whose personal glory was fleeting and ultimately overshadowed by more colorful, more enduring figures like Luciano, but whose structural innovations proved far more consequential and far more lasting than his own brief moment of personal triumph ever could have been on its own. There is also, woven throughout this entire story, a darker and more unsettling lesson about the corrupting and isolating nature of absolute power, a lesson that Maranzano himself, of all people, should have understood better than almost anyone else in his position, given his lifelong study of exactly this dynamic in the story of Julius Caesar. Power, when concentrated too completely in the hands of a single individual, when made too absolute and too unaccountable to any restraining structure or collective authority, has a way of transforming even the most careful, most patient, most historically informed leaders into paranoid, isolated figures, increasingly suspicious of the very allies and lieutenants whose loyalty and capability had made their rise to power possible in the first place. We saw this transformation begin to take hold of Maranzano in the final months of his life, as the careful, patient strategist who had spent years quietly building alliances gave way to a more suspicious, more controlling figure, increasingly convinced that his most talented subordinates, men like Luciano, represented threats to be eliminated rather than resources to be cultivated and trusted. This is, perhaps, the single most universal and most enduring lesson embedded within Salvatore Maranzano's story, one that extends far beyond the specific context of organized crime into the broader history of political and institutional power throughout human history. Absolute authority, however carefully designed and however historically informed its architect might be, tends to generate exactly the kind of paranoid isolation and internal betrayal that ultimately undermines it. Julius Caesar learned this lesson at the cost of his own life, betrayed by men he had once called friend and ally. Salvatore Maranzano, despite his lifelong study of exactly this historical precedent, learned the same lesson in almost exactly the same way, betrayed by the very lieutenant whose talent and ambition he had recognized as dangerous, but whose elimination he had planned just slightly too slowly to save his own life. And yet, even in this repetition of history's darkest lesson about the fragility of absolute power, there is something worth noting about how the story ultimately resolved itself, at least at the institutional level. Where Caesar's death led, eventually, to the rise of his adopted heir Augustus, who would go on to establish an even more durable and long-lasting imperial system built directly upon Caesar's own foundational reforms, Maranzano's death led to Luciano's establishment of the Commission, a system that corrected the specific structural flaw that had made Maranzano's own downfall possible, while preserving and building upon everything else that Maranzano had established. In both cases, the assassinated founder's personal ambition for singular, absolute authority died along with him, but the broader institutional structure he had designed survived, adapted, and ultimately flourished under new leadership that had learned, through the harshest possible lesson, the specific danger of concentrating power too completely in a single, unaccountable position. This is perhaps the closest thing to genuine wisdom that can be extracted from a story as dark and violent as this one, that the most durable systems of power and organization are rarely those built around the absolute authority of a single, unchallenged leader, however brilliant or historically informed that leader might be, but rather those that build in some mechanism of accountability, some check against the natural human tendency toward paranoid isolation and unchecked ambition that seems to accompany the accumulation of truly absolute power. Maranzano understood this lesson intellectually, having studied it extensively in the history of Julius Caesar's own downfall, but he seems to have believed, as so many ambitious and capable men throughout history have believed before and since, that he himself was somehow different, somehow more capable of avoiding the specific trap that had consumed his historical idol. He was not different. He was not immune. And his story stands, nearly a century later, as a stark and compelling illustration of exactly how dangerous that particular illusion of exceptionalism can be, even for a man as intelligent, as patient, and as historically well-informed as Salvatore Maranzano genuinely was. There is one more dimension of this story worth considering as we bring it to its close, one that speaks to something deeper than the specific mechanics of criminal organization or the psychology of absolute power. Salvatore Maranzano was, in many ways, a genuinely tragic figure in the truest, most classical sense of that term, not simply a man who suffered misfortune or violent death, but a man whose downfall emerged directly and inevitably from the very qualities that had made his rise to power possible in the first place. His intelligence, his patience, his careful study of history, his genuine vision for a more ordered, more disciplined system of criminal organization, all of these qualities served him brilliantly in his rise to power, allowing him to navigate the treacherous currents of the Castellammarese War with a skill and foresight that none of his rivals could match. But these same qualities, taken to their logical extreme, also led him directly toward the specific vision of absolute, singular, unaccountable authority that ultimately made his own elimination not just possible, but from the perspective of his ambitious subordinates, genuinely necessary and justified. This is the essential structure of classical tragedy, dating back to the very Roman and even earlier Greek sources that Maranzano himself studied so intently throughout his life, a protagonist brought low not by external forces beyond his understanding or control, but by the direct and inevitable consequences of his own defining qualities and choices, pursued to their logical and ultimately self-destructive conclusion. Maranzano did not die because he lacked vision, or because he failed to understand the historical precedents that might have warned him away from his fate. He died, in a very real sense, because he understood those precedents perfectly well, and pursued his own version of Caesar's triumph anyway, believing, as so many ambitious men before him had believed, that his own particular genius and careful planning would allow him to succeed where his historical idol had ultimately failed. Nearly a century has now passed since Salvatore Maranzano's body was found in his office at 230 Park Avenue, since the brief, remarkable reign of America's only official capo di tutti capi came to its sudden, violent end. The specific men who orchestrated his death, who benefited most directly from his elimination, have long since passed into history themselves, Luciano deported and eventually dying in Naples, his commission system evolving and adapting through decades of subsequent leadership changes, internal wars, and increasingly sophisticated federal prosecution efforts that would eventually dismantle much of the traditional mafia's power and influence by the final decades of the 20th century. The specific families, rackets, and territorial arrangements that defined Maranzano's world have shifted and transformed almost beyond recognition in the decades since his death, shaped by changing economic circumstances, evolving law enforcement strategies, and the simple passage of time that erodes even the most carefully constructed criminal empires eventually. And yet, something of Salvatore Maranzano's original vision persists, in ways both literal and symbolic, nearly a century after his death. The fundamental language of mafia organization, the very terms family, boss, underboss, capo, soldier, that most people today associate almost instinctively with organized crime, terms popularized further through decades of subsequent film and television dramatization, all trace back directly to the structural vocabulary that Maranzano first formalized in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War. The very concept of a made man, bound through ritual and blood oath to a criminal organization that demands absolute loyalty in exchange for brotherhood and protection, remains one of the most enduring and culturally resonant images associated with organized crime, An image that owes its origin directly to the ceremony Maranzano designed by drawing on his own childhood education in Catholic sacramental tradition. In this sense, Salvatore Maranzano achieved something that even he, in his most grandiose moments of comparing himself to Julius Caesar, might not have fully anticipated, a kind of institutional and cultural immortality that far outlasted his own brief, violent life. He did not get to rule his empire for decades, as Caesar's own heir Augustus would eventually rule the Roman Empire that Caesar's reforms had made possible. He did not live to see his vision mature, adapt, and prove its durability across changing circumstances and successive generations of leadership. But the fundamental architecture he designed, the structural blueprint he drew up during those brief, remarkable months when he stood at the absolute summit of the American underworld, proved so effective, so durable, and so perfectly suited to the specific challenges of organizing large-scale criminal enterprise that it survived his own death by decades, shaping the identity and internal culture of organized crime in America long after the specific man who designed it had been reduced to little more than a historical footnote in most popular accounts of this era. This, perhaps, is the truest and most fitting way to understand the legacy of Salvatore Maranzano, not as a failed emperor, cut down before he could fully enjoy the fruits of his own ambition, but as a brilliant, tragic architect, whose greatest achievement lay not in the brief moment of personal glory he managed to seize before his own violent death, but in the enduring structure he left behind. A structure so carefully designed, so deeply rooted in centuries of institutional wisdom borrowed from the Catholic Church in ancient Rome, that it would go on to outlast not just its creator, but nearly every single man who ever operated within the system he had built. Salvatore Maranzano wanted, more than anything else in his life, to become a modern Caesar. He achieved something different, and in its own strange, dark way, something perhaps even more remarkable. He became the invisible architect of an entire criminal civilization, one whose fundamental structure would continue to shape the lives, and often the deaths, of countless men for the better part of a century after his own name had largely faded from public memory. The boy who once dreamed of the priesthood, who buried himself in the story of Julius Caesar, who built an empire in the image of institutions far older and far more enduring than any single criminal organization could ever hope to be, died believing that history had cruelly denied him the triumph he had spent his entire life working toward. He could not have known, in those final violent moments in his office at 230 Park Avenue, that the true measure of his legacy would not be found in how long he personally ruled, but in how completely and how permanently he had reshaped the very structure of power for everyone who came after him. Some men build empires that crumble the moment they themselves fall. Salvatore Maranzano built something rarer and, in its own dark way, something far more remarkable, a system that survived its own founder's assassination, and went on to define an entire criminal underworld for generations who would never know the name of the man who first drew up its blueprint in the shadow of ancient Rome. If there is a final, thoughtful truth to take from this story, perhaps it's this: history rarely remembers its architects with the same reverence it reserves for its emperors, and yet it is so often the architects, the quiet builders of structure and system, whose work endures the longest after the more dramatic, more celebrated figures have faded from memory. Salvatore Maranzano wanted to be Caesar. He became something else entirely, the forgotten builder of an empire of shadows that outlived him by nearly a century. If this story kept you here until the very end, that alone tells me you love these deep, cinematic dives into the true, dark history of the men who built and destroyed empires in the shadows of the underworld. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and stay close, because there are many more tales like this one waiting to be told. Thank you for spending this time with me in the shadows of history. Until next time.